Christmas Eve, 1944. Stalag VII-A, Bavaria. 2,000 Allied prisoners sat in freezing barracks staring at their dinner rations, moldy potato peels, stale bread crusts, and water so dirty you could see things floating in it. Sergeant James "Cookie" Murphy looked at the same ingredients and saw something different. Not garbage, possibility. The camp commandant had laughed when Cookie volunteered for kitchen duty. "You are welcome to the scraps, American. Perhaps you can make them taste less like defeat." But Cookie had grown up during the Depression in rural Georgia, where his grandmother had taught him something the German guards never learned. Hunger makes you desperate, but creativity keeps you alive. That night, Cookie turned potato peels into something the prisoners would later call the best meal of their lives. Not because it tasted good, but because it tasted like hope. And over the next 6 months, he would transform a prison camp kitchen into the one place where men remembered they were human. Before we dive in, hit subscribe for more untold stories where ordinary people found extraordinary ways to survive. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far hope can travel. November 1944. Stalag VII-A, Bavaria. The prison camp kitchen wasn't a place you volunteered for. It was a place you were sent as punishment. The smell alone could break you. Rotting vegetables, rancid water, the metallic stench of desperation. German guards threw whatever they wouldn't feed to their dogs into wooden bins, and prisoners were expected to turn it into something edible for 2,000 men. Most cooks lasted a week before they quit. Some lasted days. One man lasted 4 hours before he walked back to his barracks and refused to return. When Sergeant James Murphy raised his hand and asked for kitchen duty, the other prisoners thought he'd lost his mind. Lieutenant David Chen pulled him aside. "Cookie, you know what happens in there? Men give up. They see what we're supposed to eat, and something inside them just breaks." Cookie nodded slowly. He was 34 years old, thin as a rail, with hands that never stopped shaking since he'd been shot down over France in June, but his eyes were steady. "I know," he said quietly. "That's why I'm asking." Chen didn't understand. Nobody did. But Cookie understood something the others didn't. He'd been hungry before the war, really hungry. The kind of hungry that taught you things about food that no cookbook could explain. Cookie grew up in rural Georgia during the Depression in a house that barely qualified as a shack. His grandmother, Mama Ruth, had raised 9 children on a sharecropper's wages, which meant she'd raised them on almost nothing. He remembered being 7 years old, watching her work in the kitchen with ingredients that made prison camp rations look generous. Potato peels from the neighbor's trash, bread so stale it could crack your teeth, bones from meat they'd never afford to eat themselves. "Cookie," she'd said, using the nickname she'd given him, "people think cooking is about having the right ingredients. It ain't. It's about having the right heart." She taught him to see food differently, not as what it was, but as what it could become. Stale bread wasn't garbage. It was breadcrumbs, stuffing, thickener for soup. Potato peels weren't waste. They were nutrition the rich folks threw away because they'd never been poor enough to need it. "God provides," Mama Ruth would say, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. "We just have to know how to look." Cookie had watched her feed 9 people on scraps, had watched her turn nothing into something that filled bellies and lifted spirits, had learned that the best meals weren't about taste, they were about love, translated into nourishment. When she died in 1938, Cookie had stood at her grave and promised her something. He'd never forget what she taught him. He didn't know it would save his life, and 2,000 others. Cookie walked into the prison camp kitchen on November 15, 1944, and understood immediately why men quit. The bins of ingredients were exactly what Chen had described. Worse, maybe. Potato peels covered in dirt and rot. Bread crusts so hard they could be used as hammers. A sack of grain that was more weevil than wheat. Water from a pump that ran brown before it ran clear. The German kitchen supervisor, a corporal named Hans who looked like he hated his assignment as much as the prisoners hated being there, gestured at the bins with disgust. "This is what you have. 2,000 men. Dinner in 4 hours. Good luck, American." He started to walk away, then turned back. "The last cook," he cried, "just stood here and cried. You will too." Cookie looked at the bins. His hands were shaking worse than usual. For a moment, just a moment, he understood why men quit. Then he heard Mama Ruth's voice in his head, as clear as if she were standing beside him. "God provides, Cookie. We just have to know how to look." He took a breath and got to work. Cookie sorted through the potato peels first, his hands moving with muscle memory from a childhood spent doing exactly this. He discarded the ones that were truly rotten, but kept the ones that were just dirty. Dirt washed off, rot didn't. The bread crusts went into water to soak. Mama Ruth had taught him that. Stale bread could become soft again if you knew how to coax it back to life. The grain needed sorting. He sat at a table for an hour, picking out weevils with patience that would have driven anyone else insane. But Cookie had done this before, had sat at Mama Ruth's table doing exactly this while she hummed hymns and told him stories. Hans came back after 2 hours and found Cookie still sorting grain, one kernel at a time. "You are wasting time," Hans said. "Nobody cares if there are bugs. They are prisoners." Cookie looked up at him. "I care." "Why?" It was a genuine question. Hans looked confused, like he actually wanted to understand why an American prisoner would spend 2 hours picking weevils out of grain that was barely food. Cookie thought about how to explain. "Because they're men. And men deserve to eat like men, not like animals." Hans stared at him for a long moment, then walked away without another word. By hour 3, Cookie had the ingredients ready. Now came the part that separated survival from living, making something that didn't just fill stomachs, but reminded people why filling stomachs mattered. Cookie worked the way Mama Ruth had taught him, with patience, with purpose, and with a kind of love that had nothing to do with the people eating and everything to do with the act of feeding itself. The potato peels became pancakes, not good pancakes, not the kind you'd serve at a diner. But pancakes nonetheless, fried in what little grease he could scrape together, seasoned with salt that Hans reluctantly provided, shaped into something that looked intentional rather than accidental. The bread crusts, soaked until soft, got mixed with the sorted grain and what passed for flour. Cookie didn't have yeast, didn't have proper heat, didn't have any of the things that made bread. But he had Mama Ruth's memory of how dough should feel, and he had a makeshift oven that a British engineer had rigged from spare metal. 2 hours later, he pulled out something that almost looked like rolls, small, dense. But when he broke one open, steam rose, and the smell that filled the kitchen was unmistakable. Fresh bread. Hans came back, drawn by the smell. He stood in the doorway, staring. "How?" It was all he could say. Cookie didn't answer. He was too busy preparing the final element, the water. He'd boiled it 3 times to kill whatever was living in it, then added the grain husks and potato peel scraps for flavor. It wasn't soup, not really, but it was warm, and it tasted like something rather than nothing. At 1800 hours, Cookie served dinner. The prisoners filed into the mess hall the way they always did, shoulders hunched, eyes down, expecting the worst. Father Michael O'Brien, the camp chaplain, stood at the front to offer grace. He'd done this every night for 6 months, and every night it got harder to find words. How do you thank God for garbage? But tonight, something was different. The smell. O'Brien stopped mid-sentence and looked toward the kitchen. The other prisoners noticed it too, heads lifting, noses twitching, the unmistakable scent of real food. Cookie emerged from the kitchen with Lieutenant Chen and 2 other prisoners who'd volunteered to help. They carried pots of potato pancakes, baskets of bread rolls, and buckets of the soup that wasn't soup. The silence was absolute. Chen served Father O'Brien first, placing a potato pancake and a bread roll on his tin plate. The priest stared at it like it was a miracle. "Cookie," O'Brien's voice cracked. "What is this?" "Dinner, Father." "But how?" Cookie gestured back toward the kitchen. "Same ingredients as always, just treated with respect instead of contempt." O'Brien picked up the bread roll. It was still warm. When he broke it open, steam rose, and for a moment he wasn't in a prison camp in Bavaria. He was in his mother's kitchen in Boston, 15 years old, stealing rolls before dinner. He took a bite and closed his eyes. Tears ran down his face. Around the hall, 2,000 prisoners tasted their dinner and remembered something they'd forgotten, that food wasn't just fuel. It was communion. It was memory. It was proof that someone cared. That night, something shifted in Stalag VII-A. Men who hadn't spoken in weeks started talking again, sharing stories about their mother's cooking, their wives' recipes, the meals they'd have when they got home. The conversation didn't stop when dinner ended. It continued in the barracks, through the night, as men who'd been slowly dying inside remembered why they wanted to live. Lieutenant Chen found Cookie washing pots in the kitchen, his hands raw from hot water and hard work. "Cookie, what you did tonight?" Chen couldn't find the words. "I just cooked dinner." "No," Chen's voice was firm. "You reminded 2,000 men they're human. Do you understand what that means?" Cookie kept scrubbing. His hands were shaking. They always shook now. But his voice was steady. "My grandmother used to say that feeding people isn't about filling their stomachs. It's about filling their souls." He looked up at Chen. These men were starving. Not just their bodies, their spirits. "I can't fix what the war did to us, but I can make dinner taste like it came from someone who cares." Chen nodded slowly. "Can you do it again?" Cookie thought about the bins in the kitchen, the moldy peels, the stale bread, the dirty water. Then he thought about 2,000 men who just remembered what hope tasted like. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I can do it again." Word spread through the camp about the new cook, not just among prisoners, but among guards. Hauptmann Klaus Weber, the camp commandant, called Cookie to his office 3 days later. Weber was a career soldier, mid-40s, with the tired eyes of a man who'd seen too much war. He'd been transferred to Stalag VII-A after being wounded on the Eastern Front, a punishment assignment for officers who disappointed the Reich. Cookie stood at attention, expecting, he didn't know what. Punishment for wasting resources? An order to stop making real food? Weber studied him for a long moment. "The prisoners are different. Healthier. My guards report less trouble." Cookie said nothing. "How are you doing this?" "I give you garbage. You make—" Weber gestured, searching for words. "Not garbage." "Sir, I grew up poor. My grandmother taught me that there's no such thing as garbage food, just food that people don't know how to use." Weber was quiet. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. "I grew up poor too, Sergeant. In Munich after the First War. My mother fed 5 children on less than what we throw away here." He paused. "I had forgotten that." "Sir? Keep cooking, Sergeant Murphy." "Whatever you are doing, keep doing it." Weber's expression was unreadable. "It is good for morale, for everyone." Cookie saluted and left, not understanding until years later what that conversation meant. Even in a prison camp, even on opposite sides of a war, hunger was a universal language. And so was the memory of someone who'd loved you enough to feed you. As winter deepened, Cookie recruited help. Not because he needed it, he could manage alone, but because he realized something important. What he was doing wasn't just about feeding people, it was about teaching them to feed themselves, to see possibility where others saw waste. Private Tommy Richards was 19, from Iowa, captured 3 months earlier. He'd been an accountant before the war, worked with numbers, not food. He watched Cookie work with fascination and confusion. "Cookie, I don't understand. How do you know which potato peels to keep and which to throw out?" "Feel them." Cookie handed him a peel. "This one's still firm. It's just dirty. Wash it, it's fine. This one?" He handed Richards another. "See how it's soft?" "Mushy?" That's rot. You can't cook rot away. Richard sorted through peels, learning by touch, learning by trial and error. Cookie watched him with the patience Mama Ruth had shown, teaching a 7-year-old boy the same lessons. My grandmother, Cookie said quietly, used to say that cooking poor isn't about recipes. It's about knowing the difference between not perfect and not safe. Perfect is a luxury. Safe is all that matters. Richards nodded, focused on his work. After an hour, he looked up. Cookie, why are you teaching me this? Because someday you'll go home. Maybe you'll have kids. Maybe times will be hard. And when your kids are hungry, you'll remember that you once fed 2,000 men with potato peels and hope. Richards never forgot that lesson. 50 years later, during his own hard times, he fed his family using what Cookie Murphy taught him in a German prison camp. December 24th, 1944. Cookie stood in the kitchen, staring at the ingredients for Christmas dinner. The Germans hadn't provided anything special. Why would they? Prisoners didn't get Christmas. But Cookie remembered Mama Ruth's Christmas dinners. Not the food, they'd never had much. But the feeling. The sense that someone had tried to make something hard into something bearable. He worked through the night using every trick she'd taught him. The potato peels became something almost like hash browns. The bread, soaked and reformed with stolen honey from the German kitchen, turned into something that almost tasted sweet. He even managed to make something resembling gravy from grain husks and saved grease. It wasn't a feast. It wasn't even close. But when 2,000 prisoners sat down to Christmas dinner, grown men cried into their plates. Father O'Brien stood to offer grace, his voice shaking. Lord, we thank you for this meal. Not because it's perfect, but because someone loved us enough to make it. He looked at Cookie, standing in the kitchen doorway, flour-covered and exhausted. Thank you for reminding us that we're still worth loving. April 29th, 1945. The American 7th Army liberated Stalag VII-A on a Tuesday morning. Tanks rolled through the gates. Soldiers with fresh uniforms and full rations stared at the prisoners they'd come to save. One of the liberating officers, Captain James Harrison, walked through the camp and noticed something strange. These prisoners looked different than others he'd liberated. Thinner, yes. Tired, yes. But not broken. He found Cookie in the kitchen, still cooking, still using the same scraps, still making something from nothing. Sergeant, Harrison said gently, you don't have to do this anymore. We have real food, supplies. You can stop. Cookie looked at the bins of potato peels, the stale bread, the dirty water. Then he looked at Harrison. Sir, these men are going home soon. But some of them won't have much to go home to. Depression's not over for everybody. They need to know that even when things are hard, they can feed themselves, feed their families. He gestured to Richards and 3 other prisoners working beside him. We're not cooking because we have to. We're cooking because we need to remember how. Harrison understood. He approved special rations for Cookie's kitchen and told him to keep teaching as long as men needed to learn. For 2 more weeks, even with American food available, prisoners came to Cookie's kitchen to learn the lessons Mama Ruth had taught her grandson in rural Georgia during the Depression. November 1946, Atlanta, Georgia. Cookie Murphy stood in his grandmother's old kitchen, the one he'd inherited when she died, the one that had taught him everything that mattered. 47 former prisoners of Stalag VII-A had traveled to Atlanta for what they called the reunion dinner. Father O'Brien, Lieutenant Chen, Tommy Richards, dozens of others. Men who'd eaten Cookie's meals and never forgotten what they tasted like. They'd asked Cookie to cook, using proper ingredients this time, whatever he wanted. Sky's the limit. Cookie looked at them, men who'd survived a war, who'd gone home to families and jobs and the hard work of rebuilding normal lives, and felt Mama Ruth's presence so strongly it made his chest ache. Gentlemen, he said quietly, I'm going to cook you the same meal I made every day in Stalag VII-A. There was silence. "But Cookie," Chen said gently, "you don't have to do that. You can make anything now. Real food, good food." "It was real food," Cookie replied, his voice steady. "And it was good food. Because it reminded you that someone cared enough to try." He pulled out potato peels he'd saved from dinner preparation, stale bread he'd deliberately left out, plain water and simple grain, and he cooked the same meal he'd made 100 times in Bavaria, using the same techniques Mama Ruth had taught him, with the same love that had kept 2,000 men alive. When he served it, 47 grown men cried into their plates, not because it tasted good, though it did, because it tasted like survival, like hope, like proof that even in the darkest places, someone had cared enough to feed them with dignity. Father O'Brien stood to offer grace, just like he had in the camp. "Lord, we thank you for this meal, for the hands that prepared it, for the grandmother who taught those hands what love looks like when it's translated into food." He paused, emotion thick in his voice. "Cookie once told me that his grandmother said feeding people isn't about filling their stomachs. It's about filling their souls. Tonight, we gather to remember that in the worst place, at the worst time, one man filled our souls every single day." Cookie couldn't speak. His hands were shaking. They'd never stopped shaking since the war, but his eyes were clear. "She'd be proud of you," Chen said quietly. Cookie nodded. "She taught me that being poor isn't about what you don't have. It's about what you do with what you've got." He looked around the table at faces he'd fed, souls he'd nourished, men he'd helped survive. "And what we've got, what we've always got, is each other. And the choice to love people through the hardest, simplest thing, making sure they're fed." Over the years, the story of Cookie Murphy spread quietly through the veteran community, not as legend, as instruction. Tommy Richards taught his children to cook poor when times got hard in the 1960s. They fed themselves on potato peels and creativity, just like Cookie taught him. Lieutenant Chen opened a community kitchen in San Francisco, feeding the homeless with the same philosophy. No food is garbage if you know how to see it. Father O'Brien preached sermons about communion and creativity, about how the act of feeding someone is an act of love that transcends circumstances. Cookie himself never sought recognition, never wrote a book, never claimed to be special. He went back to work as a short-order cook in Atlanta, feeding people the same way he always had, with respect, with dignity, and with the understanding that every meal mattered because every person mattered. But on his wall, in a simple frame, he kept a letter that Father O'Brien had written him in 1950. "Dear Cookie, I've spent my life trying to explain to people what it means to love your neighbor. You taught me in a prison camp kitchen with potato peels and hope. Thank you for showing me that love isn't complicated. It's just feeding people like they matter. Because they do. Always, Father Mike. Nobody ever calculated the exact impact of Cookie Murphy's kitchen. There were no official reports, no medals, no recognition from the government. But the men who ate there could tell you, 0 suicides in Stalag VII-A after Cookie started cooking. Other camps averaged 3 to 5 per month, 18 men who later said Cookie's meals were the only reason they didn't give up. 212 prisoners who learned to cook from him and used those skills to feed their families during hard times after the war. And 2,000 men who remembered, for the rest of their lives, that somebody had cared enough to turn garbage into dignity. Cookie Murphy died in 1983 at age 73 in the same house where Mama Ruth had taught him to see possibility in scraps. At his funeral, 120 former prisoners came to pay respects. Father O'Brien, 90 years old and barely able to stand, gave the eulogy. "Cookie Murphy," he said, voice shaking, "never saved anyone's life in the traditional sense. He didn't storm a beach, didn't shoot an enemy, didn't do anything that history books remember." He paused, looking at the men gathered, old now, white-haired, but with eyes that still remembered hunger and hope. "He just fed us when we needed it most, when we'd forgotten we were worth feeding. And in doing so, he taught us the most important lesson of all, that love isn't grand gestures. It's potato peels prepared with dignity. It's stale bread made soft again. It's dirty water turned into something that nourishes. O'Brien's voice broke. It's a grandmother's wisdom passed down through desperate times, proving that the poorest among us often know the richest truths. In 2003, a historian researching POW experiences found a journal kept by Lieutenant David Chen. One entry stood out. December 25, 1944. Christmas in hell. But Cookie made us remember heaven, not through what he cooked, potato peels and stale bread, but through why he cooked it. He treated garbage like it was precious because he treated us like we were precious. Mama Ruth raised her grandson right. She taught him that poverty isn't about what you lack. It's about what you do with what you have. And what we had, what we always have, is the choice to love people through the simplest, hardest thing, making sure they're fed. Cookie Murphy never wrote a memoir, never sought recognition, never claimed to have done anything special. But in 2007, the Army finally acknowledged his service with a posthumous Bronze Star presented to his daughter at a ceremony attended by 12 surviving prisoners who'd eaten his meals. One of them, Tommy Richards, age 82, spoke at the ceremony. Cookie didn't save my life with heroism. He saved it with potato peels. He taught me that the difference between surviving and living isn't about what you have. It's about what you make of it. And he made something beautiful from garbage. The plaque at the ceremony read, "For feeding more than bodies, for nourishing souls, for proving that love can be cooked." But maybe the best tribute came from Richard's grandson, who'd never met Cookie, but had grown up on stories about him. When asked what made the prison camp cook special, the boy thought for a moment, then said, "Great-grandpa says Cookie proved that being poor doesn't mean you're powerless. Sometimes the people who have the least know the most about what really matters." And in the end, that's what Mama Ruth had taught her grandson in rural Georgia during the Depression, what he'd carried with him through a war, what he'd used to feed 2,000 men in the darkest place. That love isn't complicated. It's just feeding people like they matter, because they do, always. Subscribe for more untold stories where ordinary people found extraordinary ways to love each other through the hardest times.